chair of my board is from Goldsmiths as well, so you know, heads up there. And I timed myself at 17 minutes with breathing, so I will try and get through as fast as I can. I'll share my screen now. How do you do that? Let's see, multiple screens. You've made me a co-host, correct?
Yes, I have done.
Okay, let's see if this will work. So it's really, can you see?
Yeah.
Perfect. I'm going to start this way at the beginning. It's really difficult to lay out the position for decrim in 15 minutes, but I will do my absolute best. Okay, so just a little bit about NUM so that our position on decrim makes sense. NUM is about ending violence against sex workers, and we were founded in 2012. Oh, somebody wants in at the waiting room. Sorry. Okay, it's blocking my screen. We were founded in 2012. And there was 10 years of advocacy to bring about a national process for documenting and sharing harms against sex workers. We were formerly the UK network of sex work projects, and now we're very victim-centered and informed by the lived experiences of sex workers. We, aside from the reporting and alerting mechanism, we provide victim support and crime prevention. We have a casework team of independent sexual violence advisors and people with all kinds of experience relevant. We use the information that we glean and the insights that we get from the victimization of sex workers to inform our community education to stakeholders, also any research, and also our systemic advocacy. Our membership right now is over 7,000, which we think is probably 5% of people who trade sex, but a good contingent of over 6,000 are active UK sex workers. The majority are women, and as many of you know, it's a very intersectional group of individuals from all walks of life. And we also have about 1,000 practitioner groups, and so they range from homeless shelters to doctor surgeries. And as you can see from that really blurry image, we're definitely sex worker centered, and everything comes out of that, including our values and our work streams. So this is a very convoluted process map that I won't get into, but I'm showing it only to say that when people report to NUM, there are opportunities for them to provide full consent or fully disclosed reports to police, where we facilitate that engagement and their access to justice if they choose the criminal legal system as a pathway. They can also anonymously share information and intel with police services as we're tracking predators and dangerous individuals. And they can provide no consent for police or state involvement and just share the alerts about dangerous individuals to their communities and to people across sex industries. Okay, so like I said before, we're victim-centered. So we share this information, but it is through consent. We are not an extension of police or enforcement. I think that there has been some miscommunication or assumptions about what NUM is. We do receive funds from some police forces who are engaging in making sure that this mechanism exists. A lot of times we receive reports from police about dangerous individuals that we can share through our networks. And we're also working to shape police policy and practice in terms of victim support sex workers. As we've seen over the last few years, there's been a real decline in engagement. And part of it is just the sort of approach to states and police and courts and people's perceptions and experiences of police. And so sex workers have been opting out of engaging with police directly. We facilitate that if they want it, but you know, it's up to the victim ultimately, because some people are quite victimized through the system. And also we see a drop in anonymous consent. So people are also opting out of sharing any information with police at all, whether they're identified or not. This is a cause of concern. And we'd like to work with the criminal legal system to kind of change it and make it more an environment where sex workers are safe to report harm, because the national picture around victimization is skewed without their experiences being included. So we did survey sex workers around why they're opting out, and it is for the obvious reasons. We are part of a special issue through Cambridge that's going to come through very soon, but it is that direct criminalization, the fear of stigma, and just the lack of trust. Those are prevalent issues. Okay, so just a quick word on trafficking, and the font is really small, probably really almost deliberately, because I can't spend a lot of time on this issue, but I do want to say that there is a conflation between sex work and trafficking, and also migration. And these are distinct experiences and distinct practices. And unfortunately, with a lot of the funding and the rhetoric and the discourse around anti-trafficking, that means that if you are providing support to victims in sex industries, there's a tendency to attribute the trafficked label to them, especially if they're migrants. And we find that this is very dangerous, and we should instead be funding things like anti-poverty and anti-violence. And of course, it also deflects away from those who do experience trafficking. If all sex work is trafficking and everything's the same thing, then we're not having really specialized targeted responses to eliminate true victimization and exploitation in the ways that it manifests for people. There's my lecture on that. Okay, so in terms of regulation, and I'll just quickly go through some of these major models. There are a million ways to frame regulatory approaches, but I've just kind of highlighted the top four. So direct criminalization is the criminalization of purchase and selling. We see this in many jurisdictions. Some of the impacts are jailing sex workers, area restrictions or displacement, fines. This isn't distinct to direct criminalization. We see this in other models as well, where sex workers are fined and it's pretty much criminogenic. But we do see this approach a lot. But even in the US, there are places where sex work is legalized, and that's the next one, where the state is very much involved in who can trade sex and how and where. Sex workers have to register. We see that in certain places. They pay taxes and they are covered by some labor protections, but it only usually benefits people who are indigenous to a country and citizens, and excludes migrants. Asymmetrical criminalization, I think many of you are aware of this Swedish model. This is the idea of criminalizing one part of a transaction. So in this case, criminalizing buying and not selling, but yet it indirectly criminalizes selling, and we cannot sidestep that. If you're selling chocolate and it's illegal to buy chocolate, then it's going to affect you in a lot of ways, and a lot more than I can go into today. But I can definitely tell you that this appeal is a broad appeal, because it seems like we're wanting to address the issues of vulnerable people. Unfortunately, it adheres to some of the more conservative ideologies, carceral feminism, and it doesn't make distinctions between people who perpetrate harm against sex workers and those who they identify as their clients, and also third parties are not distinct. So those who are more managerial versus administrative versus, exploiters. Okay, so I'll just leave that up for a second, but you can definitely look through the Swedish model, and also Canada unfortunately adopted the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, and that was after a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court to stop criminalizing sex workers in the ways that cause harm, and that's an unfortunate development in Canada. And lastly is decriminalization, and I'm going to make this really big. Okay, so this is the idea that we want to see an end to state interference in the lives of sex workers under their sheets, what they do. This doesn't mean that you can't criminalize things like theft and extortion and all of those other crimes, but it is about recognizing the social, legal context of sex working, recognizing structure, recognizing political economy. And so working with sex workers to regulate the industry and to root out exploitation and harm. And it also facilitates workers in accessing police protection, social protection, and health and safety. So things like occupational health and safety, things like home-based businesses get to be explored. They can communicate openly and clearly about what's on the menu for sale and what isn't, and they can do that with impunity. And there are some cases, obviously, in those kinds of jurisdictions where sex workers have been able to bring cases against managers who have been exploitive, as in the case in New Zealand. And I do point you to the edited volume from Armstrong and Abel. Lindsay and Jillian created this great book, so if you want to read more in that area, you absolutely can. Okay, and all that to say this, we have to kind of figure out what our approaches are going to be, because it's not clear that we're here to address safety. At times it's about identification of who's trading sex, disrupting the sex industry, and taking, you know, I guess allowing or condoning some collateral damage in that. And it is about eliminating sex work in society, but that ties into larger sexuality in society issues, consent, and all of those things need to be considered. We have to look at if we're interested in creating a safe industry that is about building relationships, hearing from people with lived experience, ending stigma, and exploring transition in and out of sex work, and what is survival sex versus what is sex work, and what those distinctions, how we can create safe working conditions for people who do choose involvement in sex work above other jobs, but we can still eliminate forced labor in that context. And this idea that sex workers are wholly victims, I mean, that's problematic because it is that sort of colonial approach to infantilizing the natives and that kind of thing. That comes from that place where we're speaking instead of or on behalf of other consenting adults. And I think that we either have to be very clear as to supporting sex workers in how they identify in a context, right? And then this idea of disposability, you know, in the UK, sorry, there's people emailing me, I don't know if you can see that. In the UK, there have been 184 sex workers murdered since 1990. And this is last year's card. We do have the new one up on our site. We have a Say Their Names campaign where we list the people who we're allowed to list, and we have to say the names of these individuals because they are murdered, and also they lose their lives because of illness and neglect and despair and suicide and all of these other things that, you know, if we're valuing the lives of sex workers, we have to understand the context in which their victimization takes place. And for the conspiracy theorists in the audience, we have to also look at who benefits. There are people who benefit from creating chaos in the industry. I'm convinced of that. There are people who benefit from direct and indirect criminalization, from denying sex workers full citizenship. And, you know, it is that thing about deserving, undeserving, whether we're looking at the poor or victims, who's the ideal victim, who isn't. I do point you to John Lohman's work in 2000. He's a dear friend of mine. I was politicized under the environment of how sex workers were treated in Canada, specifically in Vancouver, but he points out the discourse of disposal, and it is this concert of police and media and politicians and residents groups that come together and determine a discourse in which sex workers are marginalized and unfortunately are available for predation in those kinds of contexts where they're dehumanized. And also there are sex workers who have a very clear position on Nordic, and that is who we need to hear from. I have some colleagues in Canada who marched to Parliament and made their positions very well known. Okay, so NUM's position, there's a lot of text here, but ultimately it is evidence informed. Like I said, it does privilege lived experience, scholarship, and practitioner know-how that converges to give us in ways that help us shape programming, shape our advocacy, include sex workers, and try and, you know, respond in the ways that they need us to. We do believe that criminalization does really deter people from accessing resources, as we see in the attrition around reporting to police. There's a lot of fear there. Examples like using condoms as evidence. I mean, even if they're not taking away the condoms now, one officer told me they're taking pictures of the condoms. You know, what happens? Sex workers stop using condoms or stop carrying condoms, right? And then that if that's the end goal, I mean, it doesn't, those kinds of strategies don't make sense. We see this dehumanization. We see how criminalization in our current context affects public opinions. We see the residents groups with horrible names that I won't even like name them, but they're horrible names. And it's clear that residents have issues with litter and nuisance. They won't put out a bin, right? And they won't engage with sex workers in their communities necessarily, and they're worried about their property value and all those other things. So, you know, I think that we need to work together with communities to be inclusive of sex workers and to create services and programs that support their needs. And then obviously structural inequality, that gets is sidestepped when we just focus on populations and dangerous populations that need management instead of the context in which they exist. And we should also focus on ending forced labor and survival sex and carceral approaches, social issues, all of that. More reading needed. There are position statements and policy statements from all of these groups listed here. And Amnesty probably most controversially, but these human rights groups, they rely on evidence and they make their opinions based on what they see. The Lancet especially as well, the network of sex work projects, there's a ton that people can read to learn more about this for those who are interested in facts around this. Almost done. Okay, so I want people to learn something this year or do something. Speak to sex workers, that's first and foremost, to understand lived experience. Also consume sex worker created materials. So there's several groups in the UK that are sex worker led, and they are representing positions from sex workers who can't be out as well. So we have to make room to hear from these individuals. There is a current Scottish review, Equally Safe. You don't have to live in Scotland or to submit. So those of you who are active in industry or subject experts, absolutely do a submission. I believe the close date is the 10th. Umbrella Lane is doing a media takeover, so do have a look at that, at their approach and their positions on this issue. They are right in the thick of things in Scotland. And Scott Pep have a really incredible tool for submitting. I think they have 1,000 responses right now, so do check that out. Also, and I know the next speaker is going to talk about student sex work. There's a national student sex work project going on right now, and it's through the Sex Work Research Hub, so do check that out. And of course, you have to advocate for these kinds of dialogues in this session, and don't allow, just fight for hearing from experts and having these conversations, because it's really important to inform you all as the intelligentsia. And I think it's just, we can't control what we're allowed to know, right? And if you're in the position to donate, we have National Ugly Mug Meals, where we're providing vouchers, emergency vouchers to sex workers during COVID for food and supplies. We have a number of mental health materials that we're co-developing with sex workers. We also have a research and development team of experts at NUM that have a number of videos on YouTube. And December 17th is International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. I mentioned it quickly before. We are going to be sharing a video of people who we've invited to say the names of murdered sex workers. And then we're going to be tweeting the names of every sex worker who has been murdered who can be named on our Twitter account on December 17th. And there's tons to get involved with there if you are interested in that. And that's me. Thank you so much. Whoops.
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Raven. Wow, so much information. That's amazing.
I'm breathing now. I'll stop to breathe.
Thank you so much. And to everyone, I don't know about you, I've been scribbling away. So don't worry, again, we've recorded this session and it will be up on the website. I'm just learning so much. I think it's so much what you say about how the laws that are in place and the ways that sex workers are treated, even in situations where police are there to actually protect them and deal with violence that they incur, like stuff like condoms being evidence. It really just goes to show how we do need sex workers in the legislation decision making. We need people with those lived experiences, because it's not just enough to have something in theory. You need people who know the practice, who've experienced it, to really feed into that. Otherwise, it just continues that cycle of violence. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You.
Okay, brilliant. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who I'm so glad to introduce. This is Fowsia, who was elected as the Education Officer at Goldsmiths Student Union this past summer, and actually formerly served as the Women's Officer as well. At Goldsmiths, she studied anthropology and was involved in the 137-day people of colour-led occupation of Deptford Town Hall by Goldsmiths Anti-Racist Action, also known as GARA. She firmly believes that education is a right for everyone, and that all students coming to Goldsmiths to pursue higher education deserve fair and equal opportunities. Fowsia is going to be speaking to us on access to education, student rights, and the role that the student movement has played in raising awareness of the rights of sex workers who are also students. So, Fowsia, take it away.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you great.
Again, Raven, that was so amazing to hear. That was so much information, and I'm really glad you were able to speak with us today. Yeah, so I will get started. Hello everyone, my name is Fowsia, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Officer at Goldsmiths Student Union. Firstly, I would like to give a huge thanks to Joe and the Against Sexual Violence team at the SU for kind of putting this on, for their hard work and their constant dedication and solidarity with survivors. I'd also like to give everyone here a warm welcome this Friday evening. I hope everyone is keeping safe in these really trying times. I'm really excited to be here tonight, and obviously, like Joe said, one of the reasons she invited me to speak here today was to show the importance of supporting student sex workers, as well as giving insight into all the work that's already been done for student sex workers. I'm really grateful that I was given this opportunity to go out and research and truly understand student sex workers, and as someone who works as a student representative and in higher education, this has allowed me a better insight into what support student sex workers need and the harm of criminalisation of sex work. It has also further fueled my idea that people working in higher education should be given, and sometimes even mandated, training in order to better support student sex workers and also help destigmatize the idea of student sex workers. Obviously, I'm the Education Officer, and I absolutely believe that everyone who is coming to Goldsmiths Student Union and Goldsmiths to study deserves to be supported in every single way. So when looking into all the information about student sex workers, one question that was really important was kind of understanding some of the reasons why students turn to sex work. By looking into some of the reasons, we can better understand what support students need, as well as why the decriminalisation movement is so important. I think we can all agree that being a university student is so incredibly hard, trying to juggle essays and assignments, part-time jobs, social lives, as well as trying to prioritize your mental health and all the other bits and bobs that go into kind of surviving being a student. It's just absolutely not easy. And now trying to imagine all of that, plus the added worry that your work could possibly get you into trouble with the police, maybe even get you kicked out of your university and harm some of your relationships. That is a reality that student sex workers are constantly living with. As well as looking at some of the reasons why students might turn to sex workers, it's also important to know that sex workers will also be already in this line of work and will enter university. And that brings a completely different kind of challenge, and a different support is needed for those students. Coming to Goldsmiths means having to move to New Cross, which is absolutely lovely. I've loved my time here, and it will be a fun time for most students. But over the past decade, students have been trying to survive, while also the cost of living and the cost of tuition has been rising drastically. So students need to pay for their tuition, course expenses, rent, bills. If you're a postgrad student, you need to pay for council tax, which sucks. And so students will need to pay for all of these things, and they turn and all the other additional costs. This means that they find other means to fund their education, and sex work can be one of these ways. A lot of university students who take part in sex work are often doing this for the first time, and the criminalisation of sex work further stigmatises students who are in this line of work, which means students are forced to hide their work from their colleges and are unable to receive the support that they need in all aspects of work and study. Oftentimes, how things are going in your personal life and in your job can dramatically affect your studies. And if you're unable to kind of receive the help you need because of the fear of getting in trouble, then there is a big problem there. universities are missing out on helping an already marginalized community. And being a sex worker and a student often means you are intersectionalized with different aspects. We have BME sex workers, we have disabled sex workers, we have sex workers who are international students who are in this country and who've never been here before. And they all need their support. Now, while students might turn to sex work to fund their studies and living expenses, this isn't the only reason we see students turn to sex work. There are other reasons, such as students who are already in sex work who then become students. If we understand that sex work is work, then we can understand that there are many other reasons why students might turn to sex work. Some find that sex work offers better pay and more flexible working conditions than other jobs. Others pursue sex work to explore and express their sexuality. Sex work can be for some people a freeing and liberating form of work, which builds self-confidence and also provides a means of income. Whatever the reasons students might turn to sex work, the bottom line is that they should be able to come to university and study freely without repercussions and receiving the same kind of support that other students. There are these reasons and so many more that some people may turn to sex work, and these are experiences that we might never experience and understand. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't support students in their education. So like I said, the harm of stigmatization and criminalization of sex work has a massive impact on students and sex workers. The stigmatization of sex work makes it unlikely for sex workers to seek support, help and support if and when needed. The lack of institutionalized and legal protection of sex workers has driven sex workers to create their own safety mechanisms. For example, the National Ugly Mugs, who are here with us today, who collect reports from sex workers about violent incidences and dangerous clients and makes the data available via paid service, while forums such as Red Book, which authorities have now shut down, promote the collection of similar information so sex workers protect themselves. People should be free to choose what they do with their time, their labor, and their bodies. Due to the financial pressures placed on students, it's highly likely that some will do sex work along their studies. The criminalization of sex workers' clients has been shown to lead to further distrust of the police among sex workers and the willingness of sex workers to engage in risky behaviors out of desperation. The added trouble that comes with being a student sex worker is, on top of all of that stuff, on top of all the criminalization, there is the possibility of being kicked out of your university. And if that doesn't even happen, if other students are outing you, there is this stigma of you being a student in a place where you were constantly being targeted or harassed by some people who do find out that you engage in sex work, or not feeling safe or comfortable enough to seek help of the university because you know their position to not support students. So all of that stuff impacts students. And the bottom line comes down to, what do we need to do to support students, sex workers, and what are we missing in this line? The first thing that is incredibly important is the acknowledgement of universities that that there are students who are sex workers and they deserve to be supported. And all of my research on the student sex workers, I found it really difficult to kind of get a baseline from any university in the UK about their stance on sex work, including Goldsmiths. And I think that is one massive problem. If the people higher up are not acknowledging the fact that this sex work exists in students, then how are students able to get support? The second thing that we can do is that once universities acknowledge that students are sex workers and acknowledge that they are there to support them, the lobbying of universities to decriminalize sex work, working with companies, organizations like the Ugly Mug to help decriminalize sex work. Another thing that we can do is research. I think there has been a lack of research in relation to student sex workers in the UK. Universities are institutions which take part in research, and I think one thing that they can do is research student sex workers. One thing I noticed about Goldsmiths is that there are many small courses and short courses and modules around sex workers and LGBT sex workers, and yet Goldsmiths does not actively support student sex workers or actively engage in research around student sex workers. The next thing that we can do is mental health support. I think student sex workers often would require safe spaces, which entitles them to have specific training, specific help from people who are trained in order to support them and sex workers. Also, the creation of spaces for student sex workers, as young people should be entitled to receive sexual health advice with a safe and non-judgmental setting. They need to provide an innovative services that reach out to specific populations, and there needs to be an open dialogue about student sex workers with student sex workers, while also not placing all of the work on student sex workers. It shouldn't be on them to come to you. It should be on you to start the dialogue and reach out to these students. There also needs to be some sort of policy and some sort of support for students who are being outed. Outing is kind of letting others know that about a student's status as a sex worker without their consent, which puts students in like great risk and harm, and this is a form of harassment. And lastly, I think the biggest thing is the students' union support. And one thing that I am so proud of to be at Goldsmiths, to be working at Goldsmiths Union, is that we have our Against Sexual Violence team who work super hard with survivors and sex workers who are putting on this event here today. There are many SUs out there in the UK, such as Plymouth and Leicester, who are working incredibly hard to support student sex workers, putting in policies, lobbying their universities, and even lobbying the government. The decriminalization of sex work is not here to glamorize the sex work industry. While some people have had positive experiences in the industry, some people have had terrible times. While what university support should center itself in is offering support and guidance to sex workers who need that support without making any assumption about sex workers. And also understanding that while some sex workers may need help getting out of the industry, others have no intention of leaving and are not in any position to leave. They shouldn't be there to encourage others to go into the industry, but should be there to support people who identify within this community. So I think one big kind of conclusion or ending that I can bring this to is that student sex workers exist, and sex work is sex work. And for whatever reasons that students might turn to sex work, the stigmatization and criminalization of sex work deeply harms these students. And I think one big thing that I, from now on, will be really excited to work on is kind of lobbying our university, Goldsmiths University, and other universities to understand the needs of student sex workers and to actively support them and actively support the decriminalization movement. And that's my piece. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Amazing. Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Fowsia. That was fantastic.
Oh, no worries. I think I blacked out for 1 second, but I hope everything got out there clearly.
That was brilliant.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it just really goes to show how there are so many ideas and there are so many solutions. Many solutions already presented by yourself, presented by Raven, about how to fix these problems that we're seeing both on a surface level and at a deeper level with intense research. And there is a drive to change that, and we can do that in our different spheres. We could do it at student unions, we could do it at universities. Proof of that is that at Leicester, they're working on passing a policy to protect student sex workers. And I think they're really paving the way in a way that is just going to help so many people. At Goldsmiths, we formed the first sex worker solidarity society, which I just think is so incredible. And as you say, with the rise of living costs, with the impacts of austerity, with the impacts of COVID as well, on people's living and financial situations, now more than ever is a time to really think about these issues and the solutions at hand. So thank you both so much for giving us your time and your expertise and your insights into this area. I'd love to turn to some of the questions in the chat. So if you have a question or a thought or a musing, please feel free to put it in that chat, and our speakers will have a go at answering it. So I see that there is one question, so I'm going to read it out, and then please do continue to post your questions. So this one is from Michaela, apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, who says, it's interesting how you use victim as opposed to survivors. Why is that? What are your thoughts about the multicultural global society that countries in the world has become? And how do we approach the idea of shifting social approaches / attitudes to sex work and the violence of this huge scale? A brilliant question about language, about global influence. Raven, I think this question might have been for you because it was posted just after your session. So Would you like to give it a go at answering that for us?
Sure. Okay, so language is always complicated. It's context specific, of course. I think that the victimization of sex workers, their victimhood is sometimes co-opted, not fully recognized or realized. So when they're not seen as credible witnesses in their own lives, when they're, blamed for the situations that they find themselves in, when they're not believed, I think that there is something to say about how sex workers identify as victims versus survivors and who picks up those labels and why. I do also think that there's a lot of value in that idea of survivor, but when we see sex workers, they've survived the incident, but then they have to survive us. Right? They have to survive the stigma, the gaze, all of the issues that they have to go through in order to cope and recover. So I can see how that could be applied, but I tend to defer to how sex workers identify. And so if there is a contingent of sex workers that want to change that language, that want to, be seen more as survivors, then absolutely I would take the lead from active sex workers on that for sure. And so in the context of my work, supporting sex workers who have been victimized is our goal, but personally I might have some language issues and other approaches to how I would define that. But yeah, I definitely think that internationally also, when you think about there are different ideologies, different moralities, different contexts, and so really getting grounded in that lived experiences of sex workers and broad sex workers from sexual minorities, cultural minorities, like it can, two sex workers can exist in the same industry and be positioned very differently within a stratified hierarchy, right? So we have to look at positionality, subjectivity, access to justice, rights, citizenship, as in cultural citizenship, and all those issues that intersect. But I think that there are some really well organized and well funded ideologies and approaches to that are grounded in things that sound like libertarianism, but are very much about other people, professionals, deciding for populations what's good for them in some ways. And that manifests all kinds of different ways. So I think it starts with hearing from the sex workers in the context in which you're working, and then tying those to larger issues around social justice and human rights and access issues and representation.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, I totally feel all of that. Oh, yeah, the person who asked it said, excellent, thank you. So brilliant. That's wonderful. Yeah, this is really meant to be a space where anyone can ask any questions, judgment-free. We've all come here to learn more about sex work and decriminalization, and also just the roles that we can all play. Because you're right, there is such a large influence, there is such a large culture. Oh, we have a comment from Lou who says, yes, there's a deep paternalism around sex workers' rights. Even for those who are pro-sex work, sex workers are people that need saving. That is so true.
And it's a well-funded rescue industry out there, right?
Mm.
Absolutely. And I think so often people want to rescue people. And then those people are like, well, I've got some thoughts. I've got some ideas. I've got some, suggestions for the things I need. And it's like, no. Well, we're gonna help you for you. You don't even know. And sometimes, like Fowsia was saying, the flexibility of sex work really does suit people. If you're a single parent, if you're working irregular hours, if you have a disability, especially, like sex work can really fit around your own personal needs. So sometimes it's not a situation of being saved, it's just about being kept safe and having a framework that does that. Brilliant, thank you so much, Lou, for sharing. I guess I've got a question for both of you that I think might be on people's minds, which is about how has COVID changed the industry in the last year? At NUM, have you noticed a change or a demand of more services? And maybe for Fowsia, your involvement in GARA and student activism, have you noticed a change in students' needs in your term around safety? and how have institutions reacted to that?
Sure. COVID has been incredibly detrimental. Sex workers were impacted overnight. People, especially during the first wave and multiple waves and tiers and all kinds of things going on, they were not included as part of the packages, the furlough packages and other packages, so they lost income immediately. There were people who returned to the industry who'd never been involved, and also returned to other aspects of industry, like street-based industry, online industry. There were surges. People really new with no network, no way of sort of making sure that they're avoiding scams and things like that happened. People became, with the redundancies, obviously there's an economic driver to sex work and to survivor sex in particular. It was one thing to tell people to stay home, but to not give everyone the resources they needed to stay home is cruel, right? And so we saw a reduction in some of the reports of violence that we would receive, although they didn't stop, because people did continue to work because they had to pay rent and they had to feed their kids. But there was an increase in need for resources for, things like rent and money for utilities and food and all of those things. And sex workers organized, particularly through Swarm and through Sway, had a hardship fund, and I'm forgetting one other. There was a third hardship fund. We facilitated the Swarm hardship fund for UK workers there was match funding from one of the ASWs, Viva Street. And they were able to give out thousands of packages with money to sex workers during that time. And then we picked up with the voucher system that we have, where we're providing emergency food and supplies. It's a bag of groceries to have a meal. Don't make harsh decisions on an empty stomach. Come back to us if you need another bit, tide you over. But they're also dealing with legislated poverty around the 5-week wait with universal credit. And then universal credit, I mean, if you're a working class sex worker, it's going to drive you below the poverty line. And there were evictions happening, and this population really suffered. And still to this day, there is no comprehensive support. Not everyone can qualify for the benefits for self-employed. You have to be out to the state in ways that isn't safe for everyone. And through our network, at least if the government was willing to work with us, we have vetted members. We can get resources to people, and we're available to do that. But it was a shame that this is one of the populations that were overlooked for crisis support.
Oh, amazing. Jo, do you mind just repeating what you asked me?
Oh.
Yeah, no.
Was I that off topic?
No.
I completely forgot what I was listening so intently to you that I forgot what I was supposed to be answering.
No, that's totally fine, Raven. Thank you so much. And I do encourage everyone to check out NUM's Twitter page, which is just National Ugly Mugs, and they tweet about the meal packages and all the work they do. Just to let everyone know, we had a previous speaker and we were going to shorten the event down just to 6 o'clock, but actually we're getting so many great questions that if everyone's happy to, maybe we can continue over from 6 o'clock to maybe 6:30, or maybe not so long. But Raven and Fowsia, let me know your availability if you're happy with that, because we're getting some great questions. But Fowsia, my question to you was around activism and what kind of changes maybe you've seen from the student movement in response to institutions' attempts to keep students and vulnerable students such as sex workers safe during COVID.
Student activism has definitely changed over lockdown period, and it's been a really weird adjustment. I've been at Goldsmiths since 2016, and I've been very active in the activist community, kind of supporting loads of different kind of movements over the years. And I think it's a drastic change being an activist from home than it is being an activist in person. I think being part of an occupation such as Gara, being in a building and with community, definitely had its positives. There was a sense of community, there was a sense of kind of belonging, and even if there was the opposition, which for us was our institution, which was Goldsmiths, we had each other and we had our support. And I think while the COVID doesn't mean that that support is gone, it just means it's harder to reach out to that support. It's harder to access that support. It's harder to kind of reach out to different communities that already exist and find your way into it. I think while being in person, you're able to go to these spaces and introduce yourselves. Being online makes it so much harder. And I think it also makes it easier for institutions and even the police to criminalize a lot of things. But I think while doing my research there, one thing that I saw was that a lot of students have kind of surged towards sex work, and definitely online sex work. I think the kind of rise of like this, online platforms such as OnlyFans has meant that a lot of students have been coming to sex work, and a lot of students have been coming out of sex work, even if they don't want to be out as sex workers, which definitely changes kind of the idea of being a student sex worker. And I think has also like pushed institutions to kind of dig their heads out of the sand. And I think it means that they can no longer kind of ignore the idea that there are student sex workers. I think before COVID times, it was this idea that sex work is kind of, student sex workers don't exist. Now it's there, and like universities can't ignore it. But there are different movements still happening right now. We've got our rent strike happening. I don't know if any students here are taking part in our rent strike. We've got our campaign. I think, Joe, you're running your kind of stop defunding against sexual violence against the institution. I don't think campaigning ever stops. I think times like COVID show us like what the importance of campaigning does for us, and activism really is important. Yeah, that's my piece. I don't know if I answered your question again.
No, you have. It's brilliant. I think there's so much to say about the way that activism and mobilization has changed. For sex workers especially, it must be so difficult to make that decision to be an activist in the first place in a public light, because there's a lot more risk there than for a lot of other forms of activism. But it really goes to show that COVID has forced us all to change a lot of the ways that we work, and with National Ugly Mugs doing things like the work meals, the meal plans, meal deals, and the support that was already in place there through technology, through building a community which prioritizes safety without stigma. There really are some great frameworks that we can continue to build on, despite institutions' efforts to undermine them. We have got a question, which I'm going to read out from Civil, which is a great question. Is there a way to minimize the polarity between the police and sex workers whilst at the same time respecting each other's views? A brilliant question about police and political opinion and safety. So Raven or Fowsia or both, who would like to give that one a go?
Sure, I'll go first if that's okay. So in terms of police, okay, I think, okay, I don't want to use this term offensively, but this idea that they have a very schizophrenic approach. So they're showing multiple faces. There are 43 police forces in the UK, as you all know. And so they all come at responding to the complaints that they receive from residents, because they're complaints driven, and also this issue very differently. They all come at it differently. So how we engage is we support sex workers in creating learning exchanges with police. So by Within 4 sex workers, delivered by sex workers. It was in person, now it's digitally. We're just launching this year's package, where it is recognizing and working through the MPCC guidelines, which NUM helped contribute to, and understanding the context in that particular force area, some of how the impact of police operations affect sex workers' experiences with police and access to police, and it's kind of a context-specific response. So sex workers engaging with police, coming together to problem solve, to hear from each other, to open dialogue, to have that exchange, and then developing strategies together, right? because, you know, police are ruled by the law. They have to enforce the law. But at times law is quite harmful, and they're on the front lines too, and they see the cyclical pattern. They see some officers are very aware of the impact of criminalization. So they don't want this kind of revolving door, but they also do have an agenda around eliminating organized exploitation and enforcing the law. So we have to influence law on one end, we have to inform practice with education, and we have to find ways that it is what we do is constantly infused by lived experience, because contexts change. During COVID, contexts change, right? Things like theft of content online, people posing as photographers, like the exploitation or opportunities for exploitation of sex workers, that's an underlying current, but the environment and context always change with the times, right? So sex workers created a webinar at NUM, and it was all about online scams and sex work during COVID to educate their communities. We worked with one of our ASW partners to create a blog to inform the members who are new to the industry what to look out for, what to be aware of, and also here are some other resources so that if you're engaging because of desperation, that is the worst reason to engage in sex work, poverty, right? Because we want to eliminate survival sex. So we're there to share information, to share resources, and to collaborate with state agents and officials on making sure that policy doesn't cause unintended harm. But it starts from there. It starts with a conversation. And police are very they're aware now of like very different contexts, but yet they run under a national victimization anti-victim strategy. So they, you know, seeing sex workers, moving from sex workers being all criminals or deviants to all victims, it's a step, but it also, you know, there's issues within that labeling as well. Oh, can I shamelessly plug my book? Because I have a book coming out, my first book, and it's based on my PhD research on people who blend sex work and square work. And I think I kind of read the second question, so maybe I'll come back about the second question and let Fowsia have a chance to speak about police.
Oh, me, yeah. That was really, really amazing. I mean, I didn't do a lot of research into police. I did more research kind of into institutions, but I kind of really liked what you said about kind of the idea of like how the police will be moving kind of from criminalization to kind of victimization. But I think one thing as well, what I was learning when I was kind of doing a lot of research was, like I've already said, a lot of sex workers are not victims. A lot of sex workers are in this position, in this work because it is their line of work. The same way that we all need money to live, we need to work to make that money. And I think in terms of kind of one way I can phrase that question, I guess, just change it, is kind of the idea around the art institution, which is universities and sex workers. And I think the idea that a university having an idea that sex workers are either criminals or victims, I think is completely unfair. I think the first step for institutions is doing that research and understanding that sex workers are neither criminals nor victims, and that can fall into different umbrellas. And I think with that education comes kind of this enlightenment and an understanding that sex workers can be from any different kind of community, from any different background, can be in this for any sort of reason. And once that education is there with an institution, there becomes this kind of understanding and this acceptance, and then becomes this support. And I think that barrier then kind of takes away from this, looking at it from the idea that, oh, the institution can have its own opinion and sex workers can have their own opinion and they can live in harmony. But I think a better way of looking at it is that the institution can learn about sex work, learn how to support sex workers, and then they can kind of be in a linear line instead of like a kind of a balance. And I think that's one like positive way of looking at how institutions can support sex workers.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for both of your insights into that question and the police. I know it's definitely something that people have lots of opinions on and can often be polarized over. And I think both of your answers are so wonderfully answered that. Thank you so much. Raven, does your book have a name yet? Because I wrote
I'm
Raven's
finally in
book.
copy edit stages. And it does kind of speak to this question. I think it was about, where was it?
There's been responses.
Positive narratives and responses. Yeah. So the book now has a title. It's called Work, Money, and Duality: Trading Sex as a Side Hustle. It'll be out in May. And I'd love to come back if this forum exists to kind of go through that. But there is a question there about positive narratives. And one of the key things about people who concurrently engage in square work or mainstream jobs and sex work, they do so because of this idea of flex security, right? Like sex work offers flexibility and income security, even though the risks are being outed, being targeted for victimization and all of that. But because we're not dealing with the precarity of the labor market, because we're not dealing with poverty, the feminization poverty and all those things, these individuals have found ways to integrate square work in their sex work or vice versa in ways that do things like stave off poverty, let them fund projects like tuition, and also as part of social mobility. So there are positive narratives, but it's not happy hooker stuff, right? It's still work. There's so many Marxist sex workers that don't want to work, like the idea of work itself, the idea of identifying with work, and the idea of what work has become and how work is undervalued. That's sort of within our version of capitalism and how we exploit people and underpay and profit and etc. So it's within that context of labor exploitation, but duality is a way that people can maintain a legitimized paper trail, citizenship, use financial tools like have a bank account and still fund their lives. And so if we wanted to eliminate sex work, then we have to eliminate the things that like just, and because we're producing environments that and economic environments in which people have to innovate. And if we don't like how they're innovating, then let's change our damn environment, right? Let's change, let's look at things that value the ways that people want to work and want to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, I'm for one, I'm really excited for your work.
Me too. Oh, God. I'm in copy edit stages and it's grueling. Yeah. And they say, get out the colloquialisms. There's too many colloquialisms because, you know, you want to make this work accessible, right? But yeah. But it's also, I want the people who I interview to recognize their experiences, right? And to see themselves in the text. And so it's more of an anthropological work because I do share their stories because a lot in the book through quotations, but these are individuals that are not campaigning. They're not out there loud because they can't be, because it jeopardizes their square jobs, their kids, their mortgages. Like, so yeah, I can't wait to share it.
Yeah, I think with that question that Lou said, kind of, there was like, are there any positive narratives around sex work that you feel important to highlight? And I think I was reading a lot of student experiences as sex workers, and kind of I said it in my talk, I think, a bit around kind of this idea that there are positive sides to sex work, which isn't like anything that even includes money. I think a lot of things around how some of them are feeling very liberated and sexually free, how a lot of them, I was reading from one student experience that for her, entering sex work was a form of her kind of healing from her sexual trauma, as well as making a form of income, kind of the building of self-esteem, the flexibility, the job security. There are a lot of reasons kind of outside of money that people do sex work. And I think when people kind of just look at sex work as just a form of making money, it makes it kind of look as this kind of dirty thing, which is just only for money and has no other purpose. And it also feels, I think, a lot of people kind of who are trying to save sex workers, idea of like, in order to save sex workers, we get them out of this industry, and the whole idea of kind of eradicating the entire sex industry because it's only for money and because it's only people in poverty kind of come to it. And I think that is a kind of terrible way of looking at it, because there are obviously other positive reasons that people come into sex work. And I think making that sex work safe means that some people can come for it from money or come for it from like joy and positivity, and either way, like, they are safe to be in that space constantly. I think that's one kind of way of highlighting something positive around sex work, which I learned about.
Absolutely, I totally agree, Fowsia. And I think it's just cool to remember that, like, not everyone is driven into sex work, and people can get a lot of joy from work in the same way that we're all doing our own jobs. Some of us might have jobs that we don't love, they're not our careers. We might work a minimum wage job, and that might be fine. You might get lots of pride from that, but someone else might not. But the difference is that everyone in that environment has workers' rights, has protection, and there isn't a culture of silence and violence that's allowed to cultivate. And it should be the same with sex work, absolutely. I also encourage, if people would like to read on this, a great book that helped introduce me into this subject is called Revolting Prostitutes, by Juno Mack and Molly Smith. And oh my God, it's just such a fantastic book. And Raven, I'm so glad that you spoke about accessibility, because I think that was one of the first few books that I read that I was like, oh my God, I can actually read this.
Read it and understand.
It's not just
well, and
academic.
We gave those books out as prizes to the police learning exchanges. So it was a great thing, and it's, you know, it is a very accessible book written by 2 sex workers, and that is the kind of sex worker created content that we have to hear. Their analysis is insane, and I think it's definitely foundational reading if you're working on this issue or looking into this issue.
Absolutely. I think we've got some more questions, which is exciting. We've got a comment saying, let me just read it, sorry. I'm glad you touched on the capitalist angle of all of this. A system that is how we see it is because we live it. I totally agree. Capitalism affects everything that we do, especially when it comes to our working lives. Another one is an obvious point, but there's a big demand for sex workers of all kinds. That's a very, very good point. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame. There's a myriad of reasons why people seek out the transaction of sex. I don't know if Raven and Fowsia, you've got any thoughts on this, but I think that's also something that we can talk about when we talk about sex work. It's not just the work itself, but the customer on the other in that equation.
Yeah, there needs to be far more understanding of why people buy sex. I have a friend, Chris Atchison, who does research in Canada about that. I know there's some research in the UK about that, understanding, because you can't understand the industry if you don't understand all parties, right? And so we just need to support client-centered research that really speaks to the fact of why they engage, and it is about choice and sexual freedom. And I know sex workers who consider themselves healers and quite therapeutic because they're dealing with people who are post-victimization. They are dealing with people who have health issues and prostate cancer and all kinds of things that have never been touched, right? And so I think that it kind of ties to larger discussions around intimacy. And I think Elizabeth Bernstein's book is a really good one to look at there. And it also, like, it brings sex work out of orifices. Like, it's not about, you know, there's a lot of non-contact sex work. There's a lot of, and so we sell sex in our society in many ways. And I think that when corporations do it, we just kind of, we're okay with it. But when individuals do it, we have a different approach. So I just think that it's more dynamic, more diverse, more expansive than anyone ever realized. I learned a couple years ago about a femdom, a findom, and I was like, what? You can, like, that's a thing, right? So we're learning about, you know, different niches and how it manifests differently as the culture changes. And yeah, I just think there's a lot to learn. And that is why we need to make sure that we're hearing from sex workers and hearing about how their safety and working conditions are affected by policy and what they need in order to stay safe, to leave, to enter, all of that stuff. So
yeah, I mean, that was amazing. I don't think I have anything more to add to that, but I think one really amazing thing was I'm in a kind of group in a lot of activities that I do, and I think one thing I was seeing was that some people were gifting each other kind of subscriptions to sex work content that were actually produced by sex workers, and that was kind of a gift to each other, and subscriptions to that, and I thought that was just absolutely amazing, because, like, even if you have never kind of interacted with sex workers, supporting them and supporting the content that they create and the things that they sell and the talks that they give and the books that they make is like an amazing way of also like giving sex workers money without also demanding sex, and it is like a different kind of demand in sex work. But I think that was just something really fun thing that I was listening to, and I thought that was such a positive way of kind of supporting sex workers without
exploiting. And this is how you consume sex work or sex industry knowledge, right? In the ways that they are packaging it and in the ways that they are providing it for people. It isn't about, trying to find intrusive ways of finding out about their lives and exposés and hidden cameras and all this stuff. It's like, no, they're writing, they're telling you about it, they're blogging, they're vlogging, they're doing all kinds of things to share their insights and opinions that go beyond trading sex. It goes into societal issues and art and culture and all that. So yeah.
I think that's such a good point about how to support sex workers. I think a lot of people will be thinking like, I've learned all about this, what can I do to support sex workers? And yeah, those are some great suggestions. It's buy their books, watch their documentaries, follow them, give them clout, but also just pay for your porn. Like most people watch it, pay for it. Like if you've got a Netflix account, it's sort of the same thing, isn't it? Okay, brilliant. Maya says, so many amazing sex workers on Twitter. It's one of the best platforms for it, but they still face a lot of issues from Twitter. That is so true. We're also seeing on Instagram the censorship of nudity and the impact that has on real people's lives. Lou says, I follow femdom accounts on Twitter and they kill it. I love
we got our Twitter account was suspended, like the sex worker led, and I think Umbrella Lane's account was suspended. So I guess they have these algorithms, I don't know, they're deciding whose content gets blocked and who doesn't, and it's really disruptive. So I had to write to them, give them my passport, like, I had to basically give my blood to get the account back. And then even with some of the accounts are like Google accounts where they're deleting drives and things like with people's content, it's really disruptive and really dangerous. And, that practice has to stop, right?
Especially during a time when everything's coming more online. Absolutely. It's not only cutting away people's opportunities to work, but their support networks, isn't it?
Yeah, and their content, their materials, and it's like, that's the problem. If everybody's a victim, then you're going to see all of this content as exploitive, and it has to be banned from platforms. So I think sex workers started an account, a Twitter account, and they're, people are trying to create their own social media platforms so that they're not censored. And we don't know how well those are going to do, but it is that the major platforms are taking on, and some are being pressured to take on some narratives and discourses around sex work that are not reflective of all people's experiences.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you so much. Okay, brilliant. Well, maybe would the speakers like to do a little roundup? We didn't prepare for one, but if you want to summarize, or any last thoughts or ideas that are coming after this fantastic discussion. Thank you everyone who submitted your questions. It's been so wonderful to hear from you. We're really hoping to keep doing events like this. So thank you to Raven, thank you to Fowsia for giving us your time, especially at the end of a week, which is now it's very dark and spooky outside. And thank you to everyone who's attended. But I'll hand over to Raven if you've got any final words.
Oh gosh, just to wrap, sure. The Scottish Review, absolutely. This is our opportunity to inform law and policy. And when you do see public inquiries into sex work or related issues, definitely, especially if you have lived experience, do contribute. There are usually multiple ways that you can do that. So please do that. And just keep a lookout for December 17th. It's coming. Do honor that day. It's a Memorial Day. And do take part and hold vigil with us who are going to recognize sex workers, whether the community does at large or not. We are going to recognize sex workers in our communities, and that's all I'll say without crying. But thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Is it my turn to say something? Yeah, I don't know. I think this kind of whole time of me kind of researching student sex workers has really kind of pushed me to really start working kind of around this idea. And I think it's really highlighted kind of the importance of the work that you, Joe and Lou, do as our against sexual violence kind of coordinators. You know, I think you guys are literally the only people who are in our university who are kind of doing some kind of work around survivors and sex workers. And like, I think the lobbying of our university to kind of do more around sex workers support, survivors support, kind of funding the Against Sexual Violence program again, even further. And yeah, I'm just really excited to see kind of who I can work with. It was really nice meeting Raven and seeing kind of what connections we can make to kind of support student sex workers. And I'm kind of, it's like hearing from Raven and being here with everyone's really kind of giving me that optimism, that push, especially from 2020, which has been a kind of awful year, to like look forward to the new year and like look forward to kind of all the work that we can really do to support like everyone out there. And I'm really excited. So thank you.
Oh, thank you both. Thank you so much. And yeah, Fowsia, I really resonate with that, the more we learn, the more we can be inspired, and the more we listen to each other, the better we can learn how to support each other. And Raven, thank you so much. I'm gonna, for all of our audience participants, I'm gonna send an email around with the dates that Raven has spoken about, and links to some of the ways that you can support, some of the ways that you can help, links to the books that we've spoken about.
Do you want me to share my slides?
Yes, that would be amazing. Thank you. That would be
sure. I'll send you a link.
Thank you. This is an event that's been organised by Goldsmiths Student Union. I'm Jo. I'm the project coordinator for the Against Sexual Violence project. We are currently running our own campaign called Take Survivors Seriously, because the university has not given us the funding to continue, and we're trying to fight to keep that funding. I'll include a link. There you go, Lou's included a link, so please take a look at that if you're interested, but if not, that's totally fine. We have some more fantastic events for 16 Days Against Sexual Violence. Tomorrow we have a wonderful event at 10 a.m. It's called Coming Home, which is a guided breathwork session for trauma with Inspire Breathwork. So I really encourage you to check that out. And if you're interested in learning more about sexual violence, next week on Tuesday between 5 and 6, we have a talk by Refuge UK on domestic abuse, and they will talk about defining partner violence, forms of abuse, myths, who's affected, and student-specific barriers to leaving abuse. So we've got a whole range of holistic wellbeing and educational events. I really do encourage you to check those out. But just, yeah, another massive, massive thank you to Raven, massive thank you to Fowsia for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your opinions and your resources with us today. Thank you to everyone who's attended. And I just hope you have a really lovely week and a lovely weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.